That ordinary morning, I opened my phone, went to the banking app, and saw a number that made my heart stop. Our joint account, where we'd painstakingly saved every penny for 23 years, was down to just a few dozen dollars. Then my husband walked into the kitchen, poured coffee, and grinned smugly like someone who'd just won big at a poker game. "Evelyn," he said, without looking at me, "I've transferred all the money, and I want a divorce." He thought he'd taken it all. He was wrong. If you want to know what happens next, hit like. And comment the name of the city you're watching so I can see how far my story has gone. Don't go anywhere. This story will keep you hooked. I want to tell you something I've never admitted to anyone. Not my sister, not my closest friends, not even to myself for the longest time. I saw it coming. Not clearly, not all at once. But somewhere deep underneath the routine of marriage, underneath 23 years of shared meals and mortgage payments and whispered conversations in the dark, something had been rotting. And I had chosen, for reasons I'm still unraveling, not to look directly at it. My name is Evelyn Carter. I'm 61 years old. I have a bad knee that aches when rain is coming, a vegetable garden I've tended since 1998, and a marriage I believed in longer than I should have. And this is the story of the morning everything I thought I knew collapsed, and what I did about it. Grant Carter was not a dramatic man, which was part of why I loved him. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't sulk or manipulate in the obvious ways I'd seen other husbands do. He was steady, reliable, the kind of man who remembered to change the car's oil and always locked the back door before bed. We met when I was 34 and he was 37, both of us arriving late to a dinner party neither of us particularly wanted to attend. He made me laugh twice before we finished our appetizers. By the end of that night, I thought, this one is different. For years he was. We built what I can only describe as an honest life. Not glamorous, not perfect, but honest. We had disagreements about money, mostly about his habit of taking on home renovation projects he never finished. But we always came back to the same table, the same bed, the same understanding. We were partners. That's what I believed anyway. The first crack appeared about 3 years ago, small enough that I talked myself out of it immediately. I was looking for our car insurance documents, rummaging through his desk drawer, something I'd done 100 times before without a second thought, when I found a bank statement I didn't recognize. Not our joint checking, not our savings. A different account, a different bank, with Grant's name only. I stood there for almost a full minute, turning it over in my hands. He probably opened it for something work-related, I told myself. Business expenses? Maybe. He mentioned something about that last spring. I put it back exactly where I found it. I never asked him about it. And for a while, I managed to forget it was there. That was my first mistake. But it wasn't my last. The summer before everything fell apart, things between us had grown quiet in a way that no longer felt comfortable. Marriage has its silences. The easy ones where two people are simply content, and the other kind, where something unsaid fills all the air in a room and nobody will open a window. Ours had become the second kind. Grant started spending more time in the city for work. He'd been a project manager for a commercial construction firm for 18 years, so travel wasn't unusual. But the frequency changed, the excuses multiplied. He started being vague when I asked simple questions. When will you be back? Did you eat? How was the drive? And something about the vagueness sat wrong in my chest. I didn't want to be that woman. Suspicious. Paranoid. I had friends whose marriages had collapsed under the weight of jealousy over things that turned out to be nothing. I didn't want to be the wife who searched her husband's phone while he slept, who interrogated him every time he came home late, who turned love into surveillance. So instead I said nothing. I watched. I waited. And the wrong thing kept growing. In October, I found a charge on our joint visa I didn't recognize, a restaurant downtown, on a Tuesday night when Grant had told me he was working late on site. Not expensive. $112. I almost called him about it that same evening. Instead, I photographed the statement with my phone, put it in a folder I made on my laptop titled House Stuff, and went to bed. By November, I had 17 entries in that folder. I want you to understand something about where I was psychologically at that point. I was not a passive woman by nature. I'd worked as an office manager for a civil engineering firm for 15 years. I handled payroll, vendor contracts, HR disputes, and budget oversight. I was organized. I was thorough. I did not miss things. But inside a marriage, I had become someone I barely recognized. I had learned to smooth things over, to prioritize peace over truth, because the alternative, the confrontation, the unraveling, felt too enormous to survive. And Grant knew that about me. I don't know whether he exploited it consciously or whether it was just the comfortable groove we'd worn into each other. Either way, I had been managed. The moment I understood that fully was the day I called my friend Patricia. Patricia Nguyen had known me since our kids were in elementary school. She'd been through her own divorce 10 years earlier, a quiet, devastating one, and she was one of the few people I trusted to hear the truth without flinching. "I think something is wrong," I told her, sitting in my car in the parking lot of a grocery store because it was the one place I was sure Grant wouldn't walk through the door. "I don't have proof of anything. I don't know if I don't even know what I'm looking for, but something is wrong." She didn't tell me I was being paranoid. She didn't tell me to talk to him, to trust the marriage, to remember all the good years. She said, "Have you talked to a lawyer?" I hadn't. "Talk to a lawyer, Evelyn. Just talk. Find out where you stand before you say a single word to him." That phone call changed everything. I want you to understand what it cost me to walk into that attorney's office. The firm was 20 minutes from my house, far enough that I was unlikely to run into anyone I knew, but close enough that I didn't need a reason to leave home for a long stretch of time. The attorney's name was Diane Marsh. She was in her mid-50s, no nonsense, with reading glasses she wore pushed up on her forehead and a directness I immediately respected. I sat across from her and laid out everything I had: the separate bank account I'd stumbled upon 3 years earlier, the visa charges, the increasing absences, the way Grant had started making small, offhand remarks about simplifying our finances. Comments I hadn't thought much of in the moment, but which, strung together, formed a pattern I couldn't ignore anymore. Diane listened without interrupting. Then she asked me several questions I hadn't expected. "Do you know the full scope of your marital assets, property, investments, retirement accounts? Any trusts or business holdings?" I knew most of it. We had a financial advisor, Lena Caldwell, who had managed our portfolio for over a decade, and I had access to all the accounts in theory. But I realized, sitting in that chair, that I had left the active monitoring almost entirely to Grant in the last several years. "Get a complete picture," Diane told me. "Today. Call your financial advisor and request a full account summary. Every asset, every account, every dollar. Don't tell your husband you're doing it." She paused. "If you're right about what you suspect, Evelyn, he may already be making moves. We need to know what's there before anything disappears." I drove home from that meeting with my hands tight on the steering wheel, my heart going too fast for the speed limit. I called Lena before I even pulled into the driveway. What Lena told me made my blood go cold. Our true financial picture was not what I had casually assumed. Over the years, thanks to disciplined saving, a modest inheritance from my mother, Lena's careful management, and the sale of a rental property we'd owned for a decade, we had accumulated considerably more than I had been mentally tracking. The joint checking and savings accounts I thought of as our money were, in reality, only a small slice of the whole. The larger assets, a substantial investment portfolio, a real estate trust from the property sale, retirement accounts in both our names, and an emergency liquidity fund Lena had established years earlier, were structured differently, and critically, most of them had protections that required both our signatures to access or transfer. What Grant apparently didn't know, or had forgotten, or had not looked carefully enough to discover, was exactly how that money was structured. "He's been asking questions," Lena told me, her voice careful, "about the investment accounts, about what's accessible and what isn't. I didn't tell him anything he didn't already have a right to know, but the questions felt unusual, like he was mapping something out." I gripped the phone so hard my knuckles ached. "Lena," I said, "I need to ask you something, and I need you to answer me straight." "Of course." If I wanted to consolidate and legally protect the assets that are in my name, really protect them, in a way that's bulletproof if this marriage ends, what would I need to do? There was a pause. "You'd need to work with Diane and me together," she said. There are things we can do that are entirely legal, entirely within your rights, but we'd need to move carefully and quickly. Then let's start, I said. I hung up. I walked inside. I made dinner. I sat across the table from Grant and talked about nothing in particular. The neighbor's new fence, a show I'd been watching, whether we needed to call someone about the gutter before winter, and I gave him absolutely nothing. For the first time in months, I felt something sharp and clear rising in my chest. Not fear, not grief. Strategy. Over the following 6 weeks, I did things I had never imagined myself doing. I met with Diane Marsh 4 times. I met with Lena Caldwell twice. I reviewed every document Lena sent me, page by page, with a highlighter and a legal pad. I asked questions I should have been asking for years about what jointly held actually meant under our state's marital property laws, about what could and couldn't be transferred unilaterally, about what evidence of financial misconduct looked like in a divorce proceeding. I was not reckless. I moved carefully and within every legal boundary Diane outlined, but I was methodical in a way I hadn't been since my working years. I had accounts restructured, legitimately, in my name, covering the majority of what Lena and I determined was the family's core wealth. The investment portfolio, the real estate proceeds, the emergency fund. Everything was documented, time-stamped, transparent to the court, if it ever came to that. Not hidden, not stolen, simply protected. What remained in our joint checking and savings, the accounts Grant saw, the ones he checked, the ones he believed represented the money, was real but limited, a fraction of the full picture. I left it there. I left it exactly where he could find it, and I waited to see what he would do. It was a Tuesday in late February when it happened. I remember the morning in pieces, the way you remember moments that split your life into a before and after. The light was gray, that flat winter morning gray that makes everything look like a photograph someone took by accident. I'd been up since 5, couldn't sleep. Had been sitting in the kitchen with a mug of tea that had gone cold. Grant came downstairs at 7:15. Showered, dressed, unhurried, he poured himself coffee and stood at the counter with his phone. And something in his posture was wrong, too loose, too satisfied, like a man who had already made a decision he was glad of. I opened my banking app out of habit. The number that came up stopped my breath. Joint checking, $47. Joint savings, $0. I sat completely still. I looked at my phone. I looked at Grant, who was still scrolling his phone at the counter, still wearing that loose, self-satisfied posture. And then he looked up. "Evelyn," he said. He set down his mug with a deliberateness that told me he'd been rehearsing this. "I need to talk to you about something." "All right," I said. My voice came out even. I was surprised by that. "I've been unhappy for a long time. I don't think either of us has been honest about that." He paused, seemed to be checking his own internal script. "I've been seeing someone. I'm not going to lie about that. I want a divorce, and I've already had my attorney draft the paperwork." I looked at him. "And the accounts?" I asked. He blinked. "Just once. I've moved the funds somewhere I can access them. That's just practical, Evelyn. You'd do the same thing." "I'd do the same thing." As if we were two strangers on opposite sides of a business transaction. As if 23 years was an asset column to be settled. "She must be very young," I said. He had the decency to look away. "That's not relevant." "No," I agreed. "I suppose it isn't." He picked up his coffee. "I'm staying at the city apartment for a while. My attorney will be in touch with yours." I said. "That's fine." He paused, waiting for something. Tears, maybe, or anger, or collapse. When none of it came, he seemed faintly unsettled. He picked up his keys from the hook by the door. "I'm sorry," he said. It sounded like something he'd written down first. "I know," I said. And then he left. I sat with my cold tea and the gray morning light and the knowledge that he had just done exactly what I had spent 6 weeks preparing for. He had reached into what he believed was the safe and come away with the petty cash drawer. The calls started that afternoon. Grant must have moved fast, faster than I expected, because by 3 o'clock, My sister-in-law Roberta was on my phone with that particular tone of voice that meant she'd already chosen a side. "Evelyn, I just want to make sure you're okay. Grant called us this morning. He said, he said things were very bad financially, that you'd both been struggling, and that the divorce was mutual." Mutual. That was the word he'd chosen. "Is that what he told you?" I said. "He said you both agreed it was time. Evelyn, he seemed genuinely sad." I was quiet for a moment. I could hear Roberta wanting me to fill the silence, to cry or to confide or to confirm the narrative Grant had already delivered. "Roberta," I said, "I appreciate you calling. I'm fine. I'll be in touch." I hung up. Then I called my daughter. Maya was 32 and living 4 hours away, working as a nurse. She and Grant had always been close in a surface way. Civil, warm at holidays, careful with each other in the manner of two people who never quite spoke the same language. When I told her what had happened, all of it, as plainly as I could, she was quiet for a long time. "Did he actually take the money?" she finally asked. "He took what he thought was the money," I said. Another pause. "Mom, do you have a lawyer?" "For 6 weeks," I said. She exhaled slowly. Okay, tell me what you need." That was the moment I cried. Not when Grant announced he was leaving, not when I saw the empty balance, not when Roberta called with her loaded sympathy, but when my daughter asked what I needed, without drama, without judgment, without any agenda other than being present. That's when it broke open. "I just need someone to know it's going to be okay," I said. "It's going to be okay," Maya said. "You made sure of that." What? The weeks that followed were a particular kind of torture that I suspect only people who've been through a contested divorce can fully understand. There was the practical torture, paperwork and disclosures and financial affidavits and scheduling and counter-scheduling, all filtered through attorneys who spoke in calm, professional voices while your entire life was being translated into line items. There was the social torture, the friends who pulled away because they didn't know how to navigate the awkwardness, the ones who called with condolences wrapped in curiosity, the ones who'd heard Grant's version first and arrived with questions already half-answered. And there was the private torture, the one nobody talks about, the middle-of-the-night kind, when the house is too quiet and you lie there doing the math on 23 years, trying to identify the exact moment something began to break, wondering whether there was a version of this that could have been different. I don't have a clean answer to that. I'm not sure I ever will. What I can tell you is that I didn't fall apart, not in the way I'd feared. There were bad nights, plenty of them, and mornings where getting out of bed felt like a physical argument I had to win 1 inch at a time. But there were also mornings where I sat in my garden with coffee and felt something almost like relief. The specific, exhausted relief of a person who no longer has to pretend not to know what she knows. Grant's attorney contacted Diane in early March, presenting what Grant apparently believed was a straightforward case. He had the joint accounts drained. He had documentation of his contributions to the family's finances over the years. He was confident, from what Diane described, in a way that suggested he had not done thorough research. "He's walking in thinking he holds the cards," Diane told me, across her desk, with the flat, neutral tone of someone who had seen this particular mistake many times. "Let him walk." So I let him walk. Diane prepared our disclosures with the precision of someone who understood exactly what Grant was going to say and had already written the counter to it. Every account I'd moved, every restructuring I'd done with Lena, was documented, legal, transparent, and time-stamped before Grant had announced his intention to file. Nothing was hidden, nothing needed to be. The story the documents told was simply the true one. And the true story was this: the money Grant had drained from our joint accounts represented roughly 11% of our total marital assets. He had stolen the petty cash drawer and left the safe. The morning of the preliminary hearing, I dressed carefully, not to perform anything, not grief, not victory, not defiance. I just didn't want to walk into that courtroom feeling like I had anything to apologize for. I wore a navy blazer, low heels, my mother's pearl earrings, which I'd inherited 8 years earlier and almost never wore. Grant was already seated when I arrived, at a table across the room. He had a new attorney, younger than him, expensive looking. Grant himself was dressed in the dark gray suit he wore to important meetings. He looked at me when I came in. I looked back. Then I sat down next to Diane, opened my folder, and waited. The hearing proceeded. Grant's attorney began laying out their position. The joint account transfers were characterized as necessary protective measures, which I noticed made Diane's mouth press into a thin line. The narrative they were building was of a marriage in mutual decline, both parties equally positioned for an equitable division. Then Diane stood up. And what happened next was not dramatic in the courtroom movie sense. There was no gasping gallery, no pounding gavel. It was methodical, almost clinical. Document after document entered into evidence, account after account identified, structure after structure explained. Grant's face changed slowly. The confidence drained out of it in stages, like a tide going out, leaving nothing but the flat, exposed surface underneath. By the time Diane finished, there wasn't a person in that room who didn't understand the complete picture. Grant had been so certain he'd outmaneuvered me. He had been so certain that I was the woman he'd constructed in his mind over the last years of our marriage, the one who deferred, who went along, who wouldn't know what to do without him. He had not been paying attention to who I actually was. I looked at him across the room, this man I had loved and built a life with, this man who had looked at that life and decided what belonged to him and what he could discard. He didn't look back. I drove home from that hearing alone in the last pale light of a March afternoon, my hands on the wheel, the radio off, the familiar road home running out ahead of me in a straight line. I thought about the morning 6 weeks before Grant announced he was leaving, when I'd sat across from Diane Marsh for the first time, barely holding myself together, not knowing what I was walking into. I thought about Lena's voice on the phone, careful and steady, asking questions that helped me understand what I actually had. I thought about Patricia in the grocery store parking lot. Talk to a lawyer, Evelyn. I thought about Maya. What do you need? I turned onto my street. The vegetable garden was still dormant, the beds covered with winter mulch. The back gutter still needed attention. None of it was resolved yet. There were months of legal proceedings still ahead, decisions to be made, a whole life to be reorganized. The relief I felt wasn't the relief of something being over. It was the relief of something finally, clearly beginning. I was 61 years old. I had a bad knee and a vegetable garden and a folder on my laptop titled House Stuff. And for the first time in longer than I could remember, I was walking into what came next on my own terms. The legal process moved slower than I expected and faster than I was ready for, both at the same time. That's the thing nobody tells you about divorce. It doesn't unfold like a story with clean chapters. It bleeds, it overlaps. You'll have a morning where you feel completely grounded, almost peaceful, like you can finally see the shape of your life clearly for the first time in years. And then an afternoon where something small, a coffee mug you didn't notice was still his, a voicemail from someone who doesn't know yet, a smell in a coat pocket. And suddenly you're sitting on the kitchen floor, not entirely sure how you got there. I had several of those afternoons in March, but I also had Diane and Lena and Patricia, who showed up on a Saturday with a container of soup and stayed 3 hours without once making me feel like a project. And I had Maya, who called every other evening and talked to me about her patients, her city, the small, ordinary texture of her life, which was exactly what I needed. Not sympathy, but the reminder that ordinary life was still out there, still available, still waiting. Grant, as far as I could tell, was not struggling with any of this. The reports came to me indirectly, the way information always travels in a small community, through a chain of people who each believe they're being discreet. Roberta told a mutual friend, who told Patricia, who told me with the particular reluctance of someone delivering bad news they wish they could soften. Grant had been seen at a restaurant with a woman named Cassandra, late 20s, dark hair. She worked at his firm in some capacity, project coordinator or something adjacent. They were not being careful about being seen. Does it help to know? Patricia asked me, watching my face. I don't know yet, I said. Ask me in a month. What it did, honestly, was clarify something I'd been fuzzy on. The timeline. If Cassandra worked at his firm, if they were comfortable enough to be seen publicly together this soon, then this hadn't started recently. This had been going on for some time. which meant the things Grant had told me in those last years of our marriage, the late nights, the weekend work trips, the general fogginess of his presence even when he was physically in the house, all of it reordered itself in my mind into a shape that made a different, uglier kind of sense. I thought about all the times I had smoothed things over, all the times I'd chosen peace over clarity. I wasn't going to do that anymore. In early April, Diane called me on a Thursday afternoon with a tone of voice I'd come to recognize, measured, specific, meaning she had something concrete. "We received their initial financial disclosure," she said. "I've reviewed it carefully. There are problems." "What kind of problems?" "The kind where he's listed 11 assets and appears to have forgotten about 14 others." I sat down. "He filed an incomplete disclosure." "He filed a disclosure that tells a very selective story," Diane said. "Some of the omissions may be oversight, possibly. Others are harder to characterize as anything but deliberate. There are transfers out of a personal account he didn't disclose to us that trace back 18 months. There are expenses that pattern in a way that suggests he's been funding a second life for a while, and billing some of it in ways that are going to be very difficult to justify to a judge." I heard her clicking through documents on the other end of the line. "How much are we talking about?" I asked. "Conservatively? Across the full 18-month window, somewhere in the range of $60,000 to $80,000 that cannot currently be accounted for in legitimate marital expenses." The number landed like something physical, $60,000 to $80,000, spent quietly, redirected, funneled into a version of his life I hadn't been invited to see. And Grant had sat across from me at dinner week after week and discussed the neighbor's fence. "Diane," I said very carefully, "what does this mean for us?" "It means," she said, "that when we walk into that courtroom, we're not just responding to his claims. We're presenting a documented pattern of marital waste and financial misconduct that changes the entire conversation about equitable division." I exhaled slowly. "Okay. Evelyn, I want to be honest with you. This gets harder before it gets cleaner. His attorney is going to push back hard when we present this. They'll call it speculative, they'll argue the transfers were legitimate, they'll try to reframe everything. But the paper trail is what it is. And what it is not good for him." After I hung up, I sat in my kitchen for a long time. Not crying, just sitting with the weight of the number. $60,000 to $80,000. Money that had passed through our life without my knowledge, supporting something, someone I hadn't been permitted to see. I thought about all the years I had trusted that we were building something together. I thought about the discipline it had taken, the budgets we'd argued over, the vacations we'd scaled back, the years of careful, unglamorous saving. And I thought about how quietly, how systematically, that trust had been treated as a resource to be extracted. That was the night I stopped grieving the marriage. Something settled in me. Not hardened, not cold, but settled. Like a foundation that stops shifting and finally holds still. Whoa. The first call from Grant came in mid-April, and I almost didn't pick up. I looked at his name on my phone screen for 4 full rings, standing in the backyard with gardening gloves still on. Diane had advised me to run all communication through attorneys. I knew that. I also knew that whatever he was calling to say, I was curious in the particular way you're curious about something you've already survived. Not afraid, just watching. I picked up. "Evelyn?" His voice was different from the morning he'd left. Less rehearsed, something under the surface that might have been actual discomfort. I think we should talk, without the lawyers." "Our attorneys are there for a reason, Grant." I know, I just..." He stopped, started again. "I've seen what your attorney has submitted. The financial disclosures, the account history." "Good," I said. "Then you have a clear picture." "Evelyn, some of those transfers, there are explanations. For some of it. Then your attorney can explain them to mine." A pause. Long enough that I heard him breathing on the other end. "I didn't think you'd..." He stopped again. "I didn't think you'd have all of that. I didn't realize Lena had... I thought the accounts were..." "You thought I didn't know what I had," I said. Not accusatory, just factual. The silence on his end told me everything. "Grant," I said, I'm going to say this once, and I mean it without any malice, which I want you to hear clearly. You built this strategy around a version of me that stopped being accurate years ago. Whatever happens in court, that's the thing you got wrong. He didn't say anything for a moment. When he spoke again, his voice was different, quieter, stripped of the manufactured confidence that had been its coating. I know, he said. I almost felt something for him then. Almost. The ghost of 23 years flickered for a moment, and I let myself feel it without acting on it. Go through Diane, I said. That's all. I hung up. I pulled my gardening gloves back on. I went back to the beds that needed turning. Marut. What I hadn't anticipated, what I should have anticipated but somehow managed not to, was how the story would mutate in the social world around us. By May, I had a clearer picture of the version Grant was circulating. I heard it from 3 different directions within the space of 2 weeks, each version slightly adjusted for the audience, but all carrying the same core. Evelyn had always been controlling about money. Evelyn had become distant and difficult in recent years. The marriage hadn't worked for a long time, and they'd both known it, and it was really for the best that they were finally being honest. Cassandra wasn't the cause. She was a result. It was an elegant narrative. I had to give him that. It recast him as the truth teller, the man who'd finally had the courage to end something that wasn't working, rather than the man who'd drained joint accounts and filed for divorce on the same morning. And it worked to a degree. I watched certain people recalibrate in real time, people who'd been friendly to my face becoming carefully neutral, people who'd once included us together, suddenly including only him. Our neighbor Dave, who'd spent 15 years borrowing Grant's tools and eating my chili at block parties, now crossed the street when he saw me coming. It was petty. It was also a specific kind of painful that I hadn't quite prepared myself for. Don't respond to it, Diane told me. Not publicly, not privately, not in any form. Let him talk. What he says socially has no bearing on what happens legally, and engaging it only gives it oxygen. She was right. I knew she was right. It didn't make sitting quietly through it feel any less like pressing on a bruise. Patricia, God love her, was not interested in sitting quietly. She had 30 years of social infrastructure in this town, and she used it with surgical precision. Not spreading anything, not starting rumors, just being present in the right rooms when the right questions were asked, offering the occasional factual correction with the casual delivery of someone who just happens to know things. I told her she didn't have to do that. I know I don't have to, she said, pulling apart a bread roll with her characteristic directness. I want to. There's a difference. My relationship with Roberta, Grant's sister, was more complicated. She'd always been warm to me. Not deeply so, but genuinely so. The kind of in-law you feel real affection for, even when you know the primary bond is through someone else. After Grant left, she'd called with that loaded sympathy, and I'd cut the call short, and I knew that had registered. In early May, she called again. This time her voice was different, less scripted, more uncertain. I had coffee with Grant on Saturday, she said. And I just have to be honest with you, Evelyn. Something didn't sit right. What do you mean? He talked about the money, about what he'd done with the accounts. She paused. And the way he talked about it, it wasn't like someone who'd made a hard decision. It was like someone who'd pulled something off, like he was proud of it. And I didn't say anything in the moment, but sitting with it later, I just felt... She stopped. I don't know. I felt wrong. I didn't speak for a moment. I was careful with what I said next because I wasn't going to use Roberta as a weapon against her brother, and I wasn't going to perform anything for her sympathy. Roberta, I said, I appreciate you telling me that. Really, what happens in court is going to tell its own story. You don't need to be in the middle of it. Are you okay? Honestly? I thought about that for a second. I'm getting there, I said. Most days. Good, she said quietly. Good. I'm sorry, Evelyn, for whatever that's worth. It was worth something. Not everything, but something. The deposition happened on a Wednesday in the 3rd week of May. I'd been prepared for it. Diane had walked me through the probable questions, the likely strategies from Grant's attorney, the things to watch for and the traps to avoid. She'd coached me to answer directly, say no more than the question required, and stay calm when the questions were designed to provoke. "He's going to try to make you look reactive," she said the morning before. "Emotional, erratic. Don't give him the performance he's looking for." "I've been not giving Grant the performance he's looking for 6 months," I said. "I think I can manage one more day." Diane almost smiled. The conference room was generic, a long table, legal pads, water pitchers, the particular sterile air of a room designed to hold conflict at a professional temperature. Grant's attorney, whose name was Fielding, was younger than I'd expected, well-dressed in the way that signals money without announcing it. He had the manner of someone who was very good at his job and knew it. He began with the basic biographical questions: the history of our marriage, the timeline of our finances, my professional background, establishing the record. I answered each one plainly, exactly as Diane had prepared me. Then he shifted. "Mrs. Carter, can you describe your involvement in managing the family's financial accounts over the course of the marriage?" "I was actively involved for the first 15 years or so," I said. "In the last 8 years, I shifted more of the day-to-day management to my husband, though I maintained oversight." "When you say oversight, what does that mean practically?" "I had access to all accounts. I reviewed statements. I met with our financial advisor." "But you weren't making the day-to-day decisions." "That's correct." Fielding made a small note. "And at some point last year, you began restructuring certain accounts into your name alone. Is that accurate?" "I worked with my financial advisor and my attorney to reorganize assets that were legally within my rights to organize," I said. "Yes." "Can you tell me what prompted that?" I looked at him steadily. "I had reason to believe the marriage was in financial jeopardy." "And what gave you that reason?" "Patterns of financial behavior I'd observed, an account I discovered that I hadn't been informed of, a change in my husband's conduct around our shared finances." Fielding tilted his head very slightly. "Weren't you concerned that unilaterally moving assets could be seen as anticipatory, as laying groundwork for a divorce?" "I was concerned," I said, "that my financial security was at risk. I took legal steps to protect it. Everything I did was documented, transparent, and within the law." He tried several different angles after that, each one a variation on the same theme, attempting to reframe my preparation as aggression, my protection as provocation. Each time I answered him with exactly the words that were true, no more and no less. At one point he asked about a specific transfer, an amount, a date, a destination, and I watched him carefully because the question had a quality to it that made me think he expected me not to know the answer. I knew the answer. I'd reviewed every transaction with Lena twice. I gave it to him precisely and watched something minute shift in his expression. He moved on. When it was over, Diane and I walked to her car in the parking structure, and she said very simply, "That was well done." "Did it help us?" I asked. "It didn't hurt us," she said, which against Fielding is basically the same thing. I drove home and sat in the driveway for 10 minutes before going inside. Not from distress, just from the accumulated weight of performing composure for 5 straight hours while every nerve in my body had been at full alert. I was exhausted in the specific way of someone who has run a race nobody else could see, but I had run it and I hadn't stumbled. June brought a development I hadn't expected, and it came not from the legal process but from Lena. She called on a Tuesday evening, and I could hear the careful precision in her voice that meant she was choosing her words as she spoke them. "I've been going back through the accounts," she said, "back further than we looked initially. Evelyn, I think there's more." "More transfers?" "More of a pattern. There are withdrawals that, individually, each look relatively routine. A few hundred here, a few hundred there. But when you map them over a 30-month period," she paused, "they look like someone maintaining a regular secondary expense. Consistent amounts, consistent intervals." 30 months. 2.5 years. "How much total?" I asked. "Across that window? Adding conservatively? Probably another 40,000, possibly closer to 50. I pressed my hand flat on the kitchen table, not because I needed the support, but because I needed something concrete to press against. "Lena," I said, "how long have you suspected this?" A brief pause that told me something. "I've had questions," she said carefully, "for a while. But I didn't have a clear enough picture to bring you something concrete. Evelyn, you need to know, I went over everything I could possibly cross-reference. Some of this I'm still not certain about. I don't want to give you numbers that later turn out to be wrong." "I understand," I said. "Send me everything you have, all of it." "I will. But Evelyn, how are you doing? I mean that question seriously." I looked out the kitchen window at the yard. The vegetable beds had started to wake up. The first green of new growth just visible, small and tentative against the dark soil. "I'm managing," I said. "Some days better than others." "That's the honest answer," she said. "I'll send you the files tonight." After I hung up, I sat for a while in the quiet of the kitchen. The math was adding up in a direction I hadn't even fully imagined when I'd sat across from Diane Marsh the first time, barely holding it together, not knowing what I was walking into. Grant hadn't just drained our accounts and walked out. He'd been quietly, methodically, for years, treating our shared life as a fund to be skimmed, siphoning money away in amounts small enough to miss but consistent enough to matter, building a parallel existence while I'd been buying groceries, managing the house, growing tomatoes in the backyard, and trusting that we were building something together. The grief I'd thought I was done with came back that night, in a different form. Not grief for the marriage, grief for the years, for all the small moments of ordinary trust that now looked different in the rearranged light of what I was learning. Every budget conversation, every discussion about retirement timelines, every time I told myself that the vague wrongness I felt was my own insecurity, not evidence of something real. I had not been wrong. I had been right, and I had been talked out of it, gently and consistently, for years. That, I realized, sitting in my quiet kitchen, was the thing that was going to take the longest to forgive. Not the money. The years I'd spent doubting my own judgment, while someone I trusted worked very hard to give me reason to. I went to bed. I didn't sleep well. But in the morning, I forwarded Lena's files to Diane and made a cup of tea and sat in the garden and watched the new green growing in the beds, stubborn and alive despite everything. Some things hold. Even after a hard winter, even after everything, I was still one of them. Diane scheduled the full hearing for the second week of July, and the 6 weeks between that phone call and the actual date were some of the strangest of my life. Strange because on the surface, very little was happening. The legal machinery moved at its own pace, documents exchanged, schedules confirmed, motions filed and answered, and there was nothing for me to do in the gaps except live my regular life and wait. I weeded the garden. I had dinner with Patricia twice. I called Maya every other evening. I slept badly some nights and fine on others. I ate cereal for dinner more often than I would have admitted to anyone, and underneath all of it, constantly, like a low current running through everything I touched, the weight of what was coming. I had been in that preliminary hearing months earlier, had watched the first layer of Grant's strategy unravel in real time, but that had been procedural, foundational. This was different. This was the courtroom, the full presentation, the moment where everything Diane and Lena and I had spent 6 months assembling would be laid in front of a judge and argued over in the fluorescent light of a county courthouse. I was not afraid exactly, but I was not calm either. I was something in between. The particular alertness of a person who has done everything they can do and is now simply waiting to find out whether it was enough. The Thursday before the hearing, I drove to Diane's office for a final preparation session. She had a thick folder open on her desk, color-coded with small paper tabs, and when I sat down across from her, she looked at me the way she'd learned to look at me. Direct, no softening, no preamble. "Here's where we are," she said. "We are going to present 3 things. 1. The documented history of marital waste, the transfers, the secondary expenses, the 30-month pattern Lena identified. 2. The full asset picture, which makes clear that the accounts Grant drained were not representative of the family's financial holdings. 3. Grant's selective financial disclosure, specifically the assets he omitted from his initial filing. And Fielding? I asked. What's his play? He's going to argue that your account restructuring was preemptive financial maneuvering. Essentially, that you moved assets in anticipation of divorce in order to disadvantage Grant. He'll try to make it about your conduct, not his. Can he make that work? Diane considered that for a moment, and I appreciated that she didn't rush to reassure me. He can make noise with it, she said. Whether it sticks depends on how clearly we can establish the timeline. The critical fact is that your restructuring began before you had any formal indication of divorce. It was defensive, not offensive. The paperwork supports that, but we need the judge to follow the chronology carefully. And the marital waste, the 100,000+, that's our strongest ground. She tapped the folder. The documentation is thorough and the pattern is unambiguous. Fielding is going to argue that some of those transfers had legitimate purposes. The problem for him is that no legitimate purpose has been identified or documented for the majority of them. When a judge sees a regular, sustained pattern of withdrawals over 30 months that can't be accounted for with receipts or paper trail, she paused. That tells its own story. I nodded. I looked at the folder with all its careful tabs. Diane, I said, what's the realistic outcome? She was quiet for a moment, not hesitating, choosing. Realistically, the marital waste claim significantly alters the equitable division calculation. In a case without that documentation, you'd likely see a fairly standard split of the marital estate. With it, the judge has grounds to award you a disproportionate share to offset what was dissipated. Grant also has the issue of his incomplete initial disclosure, which damages his credibility with the court independent of anything else. She met my eyes. I think we're in a strong position. I don't make promises in courtrooms, but I think we're in a strong position. I drove home from that meeting with the windows down. July heat, late afternoon, the smell of cut grass from somewhere. I thought about the woman who had sat across from the same desk 6 months earlier, with her careful folder of visa charges, and her carefully not asked questions, and her desperate, fragile belief that she might be wrong about all of it. She wasn't wrong. Grant called me the evening before the hearing. I saw his name and picked up before I'd fully decided to, which was a habit I apparently hadn't broken. I'm not calling to negotiate, he said immediately, which told me he'd thought carefully about how to open. I don't know. I wanted to talk to you. Grant, I said carefully, we're in front of a judge tomorrow. I know. A pause. Evelyn, some of what's going to come out tomorrow, I want you to know that I'm not... He stopped, started differently. I didn't plan for it to go this way. The money, I know how it looks. I know what the numbers look like. I sat down in the kitchen chair. How does it look to you? I asked. He was quiet for a long moment, long enough that I thought about asking again. It looks like I made decisions that I told myself were about protecting myself, he said, and maybe some of them were, and maybe some of them were just selfish. I don't know. I'm still working through that. I believed him on that last part at least, not as an excuse, just as a fact. You spent 30 months redirecting money from our shared life, I said, keeping my voice even. While I was in this house making a shared life, that's not a complicated thing to work through, Grant. That's just what you did. He didn't argue with it. That surprised me slightly. I know, he said quietly. I know. I thought about adding something else, about the years, about the trust, about all the small moments I now read differently. But I didn't, because this wasn't the place for it, and because whatever he was processing tonight, it was his to process. I was done carrying his weight. Get some sleep, I said. I'll see you tomorrow. I hung up and sat in the quiet kitchen for a while. Outside, the last daylight was going. The garden was just visible through the window, dark shapes in the fading light. I had a glass of water and went to bed and, surprisingly, slept. The courtroom was smaller than I remembered from the preliminary hearing, or maybe I was less overwhelmed by it this time. Same flat institutional lighting, same long tables, same water pitchers, same barely perceptible hum of the ventilation system. I arrived 15 minutes early with Diane, and we went through the documents one final time, quietly, the way athletes do final checks on equipment before a race. Not because you expect anything to be different, but because it steadies you. Grant arrived with Fielding 7 minutes later. I watched them come in from my peripheral vision. Grant was in the dark gray suit again. The one from the preliminary hearing, the one he wore to important meetings. He looked tired. Not the strategic kind of tired that performs well in a courtroom, but actually tired, the way a person looks when they haven't been sleeping. Good, said a small, uncharitable part of me. The judge was a woman named the Honorable Sandra Voss, early 60s, with reading glasses and an expression that gave nothing away. She had a reputation, Diane had told me, for being impatient with evasion and thorough in her reading of financial documentation. Both of those things worked in our favor. Judge Voss opened proceedings with brief administrative matters, then turned to the substance of the case. Fielding presented first, as Grant's side had petitioned for the hearing. He was as good as I'd expected. Composed, measured, professionally sympathetic in the way that doesn't actually feel like sympathy. He framed Grant's transfer of the joint accounts as a protective measure taken by a man who feared financial instability in a deteriorating marriage. He characterized my account restructuring as the real act of preemption, a calculated move by a woman who had been actively preparing to disadvantage her husband. He said the phrase disadvantage her husband with a particular weight that I understood was meant to land as an accusation. Beside me, Diane wrote something on her legal pad and slid it toward me. It said, "He's working hard. That means he knows we have the better case." I kept my face still. Fielding's presentation ran about 40 minutes. He was efficient. He emphasized the early account transfers repeatedly, knowing that framing them as the primary financial event in this marriage was his best play. If the judge accepted that frame, that the story was about what I'd moved, not what Grant had spent over 30 months, the whole calculus shifted. Then Diane stood up. She started with the timeline, not argumentatively, just as a sequence of documented facts. She walked the judge through every step. The date I'd first discovered the separate account, the dates of the visa charges I'd photographed, the date of my first meeting with her office, and crucially, the dates of every single restructuring action I'd taken with Lena. She placed each date against a documented external event, a specific charge, a specific account inquiry Grant had made, a specific communication, to demonstrate not just that I had acted before the divorce filing, but why, and what specific information had precipitated each action. It was meticulous. It was 30 minutes of pure chronological precision, and by the end of it, the timeline we'd constructed was simply visible. Not argued, just visible. Here's what happened. Here's when. Here's why. Then she turned to the marital waste documentation. She presented the 30-month pattern Lena had identified with the same methodical care. Account statement by account statement, transfer by transfer, each one mapped against the corresponding period of our marriage. The picture that emerged was not a series of isolated decisions. It was a system, regular, consistent, sustained over 2.5 years. A parallel expense structure maintained quietly alongside our shared household while I had bought groceries and paid utility bills and believed I knew what our financial life looked like. I watched Judge Voss's face during this portion of the presentation. She had reviewed the documents before the hearing. Clearly, she was following Diane's presentation not as new information, but as confirmation, checking the exhibit numbers, cross-referencing. At one point, she asked Diane a specific question about the accounting methodology Lena had used to aggregate the withdrawals, and Diane answered it precisely, and the judge made a small notation. Fielding objected twice during this section. Both objections were overruled. Grant, at his table across the room, was very still. I had not allowed myself to look at him directly since we'd entered the courtroom. Not out of anger, or not only out of anger. More because I knew that if I looked at him too directly, I would feel something complicated, something that mixed grief and clarity in proportions I couldn't control. And I needed to be clear right now. So I kept my eyes on Diane, on the judge, on the exhibit sheets in front of me. Then Diane got to the disclosure issue. "Your Honor," she said, with the tone of someone presenting a concluding argument they believe stands on its own. The respondent's initial financial disclosure omitted 14 assets with a combined declared value of approximately $230,000. We understand that some of these omissions may be characterized as oversights. However, several of the omitted accounts are directly related to the same financial pattern we've been reviewing. Accounts which, had they been disclosed, would have made that pattern far more legible from the outset. She paused a beat. "We're not asking the court to presume bad faith from an incomplete filing alone. We're noting that when that incomplete filing is viewed alongside the documented 30-month pattern of undisclosed expenditure, the aggregate picture is one of sustained financial conduct that was not transparent to the petitioner and which significantly disadvantaged her during the course of the marriage. Fielding was on his feet immediately. Your Honor, the characterization of those omissions is related to— I've read the documentation, Mr. Fielding. Judge Voss's voice was even, without emphasis. I'll take your written response under consideration. Sit down. He sat. Beside me, Diane did not look at me, did not change her expression. But I saw her exhale once, barely perceptibly, the way a person does when something they've been holding finally releases slightly. The recess came at midday. Diane and I ate sandwiches in a small conference room down the hall from the courtroom, and neither of us said much. There wasn't much to say. The morning had gone the way it had gone. What came in the afternoon was outside our control. I called Maya during the recess. She answered on the second ring. How is it? She asked. Hard to read, I said honestly. Diane thinks well. I think it went the way it needed to go. Are you okay? I'm tired, I said. And I'm okay. Both at the same time. Mom? A brief pause. Whatever happens this afternoon, you're going to be fine. You know that, right? Like actually know it, not just say it. I thought about that for a second, about whether I actually knew it. Yeah, I said, I think I actually know it. After the recess, Fielding made his counter-presentation. He was working harder now, the careful composure slightly more effortful, the selections more pointed. He argued that the pattern Diane had identified was, in isolation, circumstantial, that the accounts Lena had flagged could have legitimate explanations that simply hadn't been documented in the normal course of household financial management, that the omitted disclosures were administrative errors, not evidence of bad faith, that my restructuring of assets, whatever the timeline, had demonstrably changed what Grant could access, and that framing it purely as protective ignored its practical effect. He was making the best case available to him. I could see that, and the best case available to him was not strong enough. The afternoon session stretched past 3 o'clock. There were additional exchanges, Diane responding to Fielding's counter-arguments, Fielding responding to those responses, Judge Voss asking occasional pointed questions of both sides that made it very clear she had done her reading. At one point, she asked Grant's attorney a direct question about the 30-month withdrawal pattern. Can you provide any documentation of the purposes these withdrawals served? Fielding said they had not yet been able to reconstruct the full accounting for that period. Judge Voss wrote something down. At 4:20, she called the session to a close and told both parties she would provide her written ruling within 3 weeks. 3 weeks. I walked out of that courtroom with Diane into the late afternoon heat, and we stood on the courthouse steps for a moment without speaking. The sun was still high. The parking lot stretched out in front of us, full of ordinary cars. An ordinary July afternoon happening all around us, as if the inside of that building was not where someone's life was being sorted into a before and after. How do you feel? Diane asked. Strange, I said. Like I've been running for months and someone just told me the finish line is 3 weeks away, and I still have to keep running, but slower. That's exactly what it is, she said. Go home. Eat something that isn't cereal. I almost laughed. I drove home with the windows down again. July heat, the particular smell of summer in a town you've lived in long enough for the seasons to have a scent. I thought about the courtroom. I thought about Grant, still at the table when I'd left. His attorney leaning toward him saying something quiet. I thought about the specific quality of stillness he'd had during Diane's presentation. Not the stillness of someone waiting to counter, but the stillness of someone absorbing a thing they had refused to anticipate. He had been so sure he knew me. That was the thing I kept returning to, not with bitterness, but with something more like sorrow. He had looked at 23 years of partnership and constructed a version of me that was pliable, unaware, dependent on his management of things. And he'd built his entire exit strategy around that version of me holding still. The version of me he hadn't factored in had been sitting in a law office 6 months ago, asking questions she should have asked years earlier. The version he hadn't factored in had gone through 30 months of bank statements with a flashlight, not because she wanted to be right, but because she'd finally stopped talking herself into being wrong. I pulled into my driveway. The garden was full and alive in the late afternoon light. The tomatoes going red now, the beans climbing their wire, the whole bed dense with growth in a way that always looked slightly miraculous to me, this annual argument that things could start over. I sat in the car for a minute. 3 weeks. I'd waited longer than that before, and on harder things. I'd waited 6 months of a marriage dissolving around me before I'd allowed myself to see it clearly. I'd waited my whole adult life to understand that protecting yourself wasn't the same as being unloving, that you could care about someone deeply and still refuse to let them take you apart. I got out of the car. I went inside. I made dinner, actual dinner, not cereal, in tribute to Diane, and ate it at the kitchen table with the window open to the summer evening, and somewhere in the middle of it, quietly and without drama, I realized I wasn't afraid of the 3 weeks. Whatever the judge wrote in that ruling, and I believed it would go our way, I genuinely believed it. I had already survived the part that was mine to survive. I had already done the thing that mattered. I had stopped waiting for someone else to tell me what was true. That, I was learning, was the ruling that changed everything, and it hadn't come from any judge. It had come from me, on an ordinary morning in a parking lot, finally picking up the phone. The 3 weeks felt like 3 months, and also like 3 days, depending on which hour I was living through. I had told myself, walking away from that courthouse, that I wasn't afraid of the wait, and I meant it when I said it. But meaning something and living it are two different things, and there were nights in that July heat when I lay awake running the hearing back through my mind, frame by frame, looking for the moments I might have misread. Diane's exhale on the courthouse steps, Fielding's expression when Judge Voss told him to sit down, the notation the judge had made after asking about the 30-month withdrawals. I read those moments as hopeful, but I'd also spent years reading Grant's silences as benign, and I'd been wrong about that. So my own capacity for accurate interpretation felt less reliable than I would have liked. Patricia called on a Saturday morning in the second week of waiting, and her opening line was, "Stop running the hearing in your head. You've done it enough." "How did you know I was doing that?" "Because I know you," she said, "and because you do it with everything. Come have lunch." I went. We ate on her back porch and talked about her garden, her daughter's new apartment, a book she'd been reading that she thought I'd like. She mentioned Grant exactly once when I brought him up, and then let the subject drop when I was done with it. That was Patricia's particular gift. She never needed to make the conversation about what she thought you should be feeling. She just kept you company in whatever you were actually feeling, which is rarer than it sounds. The ruling arrived on a Thursday afternoon, the 19th day of the 3-week window. Diane called me at 2:47 p.m., and I knew from the first syllable that it was good news, not because her voice was excited, but because it had the quality of someone setting something heavy down with care. "I have the ruling," she said. "Can you come in?" "Tell me now, I said. I was standing in the kitchen, one hand on the counter. A brief pause. The judge ruled in our favor on the marital waste claim. She found the 30-month pattern constituted documented dissipation of marital assets and ordered those funds factored into the equitable division calculation. The incomplete disclosure was formally noted and weighed against Grant's credibility in her assessment. Another pause. "Evelyn, the division she's ordered, it's significantly weighted in your direction, including the assets Grant expected to claim partial rights to based on his initial filing." I stood there. "How significant?" I asked. Diane told me the number. My hand tightened on the counter. "Come in," she said. "I want to walk you through all of it properly, but I wanted you to know before you came." "Yes," I said. "Okay, I'll be there in 20 minutes. I hung up. I stood in my kitchen for a moment, completely still, the afternoon light coming through the window the way it always did at this hour, falling across the table in that particular slant that meant it was mid-afternoon in summer. I had won. Not perfectly. Not without cost. Not in the way that erases everything that preceded it. But I had won, in the way that actually matters. The legal kind, the documented kind, the kind that no one could take back. I sat down very suddenly, not because my legs gave out, but because it felt like the right thing to do. Just sit. Just be in the moment for a second before I drove across town and started translating it into paperwork. I thought about the morning Grant left, the gray light, his rehearsed voice, the $47 in the joint checking, the satisfaction in his posture, the posture of a man who believed he had outmaneuvered something. I hoped wherever he was right now, whatever he was doing, his phone was ringing. Diane walked me through the ruling for nearly 2 hours. Judge Voss had been thorough in a way that was both professionally impressive and, reading it line by line, quietly devastating for Grant's position. The marital waste finding was unambiguous. She had accepted Lena's accounting methodology without significant qualification, and the language she used in characterizing the 30-month withdrawal pattern was careful but clear. She did not use the word fraudulent. She didn't need to. What she wrote said the same thing in judicial language that left no room for appeal on the substance. The asset division reflected the waste finding directly. Grant had arrived at this divorce expecting to leave with roughly half the marital estate. What he was awarded was considerably less, weighted by the amount the court had determined he'd dissipated, plus adjustments for the assets he'd failed to disclose in his initial filing, which the judge had noted separately with language that communicated her view of that omission without stating it as finding of fact. The joint account funds he'd drained, the ones he'd transferred on that February morning with such confidence, were ordered returned in full, factored into his share of the settlement, which meant his triumphant seizure of that money ultimately cost him more than he'd taken. There's a particular satisfaction in that kind of arithmetic. I'm not going to pretend there isn't. Are they going to appeal? I asked. Fielding may advise it, Diane said, but an appeal on a marital waste finding is difficult when the documentation is this thorough. They'd need to challenge the accounting methodology, and that's a hard road when the methodology was sound. She paused. I think they'll negotiate instead. Try to adjust some of the specifics at the margins. We'll see. And if they do appeal? We defend it, she said simply. But I don't think they will. I think Grant's attorney is going to sit across from him tonight and explain very clearly what another round of this looks like. I thought about that. Grant sitting across from Fielding, hearing the ruling parsed for him, understanding the full picture of what had happened. The version of Evelyn he'd constructed in his mind, the one who wouldn't know what she had or what to do with it. Encountering the version that had spent 6 months methodically, quietly, taking her life back. I didn't feel triumphant, exactly. The word I kept coming back to was accurate. The outcome was accurate. It reflected what was true. That's all I had ever wanted, for the truth to be visible to everyone who needed to see it. Grant called 2 days after the ruling. I let it go to voicemail, then listened to the message standing in the garden in the early morning. His voice was different from every previous version, not the rehearsed confidence of the morning he left, not the uncertain late-night reaching of the call before the hearing, not even the quietly stunned quality of the hearing itself. This was something else. Flat. Hollowed out. Evelyn, I got the ruling. I don't have a lot to say that's going to be useful. Fielding is going to reach out to Diane about the timeline for the property transfers. A long pause. I just wanted to tell you that I know what I did, not in the legal sense. I know what I actually did. And I'm sorry. I know it doesn't do anything. I just needed you to know that I know. I stood in the garden with my phone and listened to the silence after his voice stopped. I didn't call him back. I wasn't being cold, or maybe I was being a little cold, and that was okay. I gave myself that. But mostly I didn't call back because there was nothing useful to say. He knew what he'd done. I knew what he'd done. The court knew what he'd done. His apology was real, I thought. It had the particular sound of something a person says when they've run out of other options and are left with just the truth of themselves. But real didn't mean it required a response from me. I owed him nothing, including absolution. What I did do was call Maya. I played her the voicemail, and she listened without interrupting, and when it ended, she was quiet for a moment. How do you feel about it? She asked. Like it's the first genuinely true thing he's said to me in years, I said, which is something. But it's not enough to undo what it cost me to hear. Yeah, she said. Yeah, that makes sense. I'm not angry at him, I said, trying to work it out as I said it. I don't think I was ever just angry. I was I was hurt, and I was scared, and I was furious underneath everything that he treated 23 years as something he could just redact, like I was a line item he could remove from a budget. I paused. But I don't want to stay in that. I don't want to carry his weight into whatever I'm doing next. Then don't, Maya said. It's not that simple. I know it's not, she said. But it starts with deciding. You've already decided 100 harder things. She wasn't wrong. Yes, the practical aftermath of the ruling was not simple or fast. There were property transfers to coordinate, retirement accounts to divide, according to the court's formula, paperwork that moved at the speed of legal bureaucracy. Which is to say, slowly, with many follow-up calls required and several instances where something that should have been straightforward took 3 weeks and 2 additional letters from Diane's office. There were tax implications to sort through with a CPA Lena recommended, and an insurance restructuring I hadn't anticipated, and a half dozen other things that arrived in the mail in envelopes I'd learned to open immediately rather than setting aside for a day when I felt more ready. There was no day when I felt more ready, so I just opened the envelopes. The house was the thing I hadn't fully decided yet. Grant and I had owned it together for 18 years. It was a solid, undramatic colonial on a quiet street with a yard I'd spent 15 of those years making into a garden. I had walked every inch of that property so many times I could navigate it in the dark. The kitchen window where the afternoon light came in at that particular angle. The back porch where I'd drunk coffee through enough seasons to lose count. The vegetable beds where something kept growing regardless of what else was happening. The court had awarded me rights to it, as the primary occupant and as part of the asset division. I could stay. Or I could sell and use the proceeds toward something else. Toward the coastal place I'd been dreaming about for years, the one Grant and I had talked about vaguely as a retirement fantasy without ever doing anything concrete about. Patricia thought I should stay. This is your home, Evelyn. Don't let him take that from you, too. Maya thought I should go. You've been building toward this your whole life, Mom. Don't stay because leaving feels like losing. Lena, when I asked her to run the numbers, laid out both scenarios without editorializing, which was why I trusted her. I sat with it for most of August. I walked the garden. I sat on the back porch. I looked at the kitchen window. And then I called a real estate agent. Not to list the house immediately. I wasn't ready for that yet, but to start understanding what it was worth and what it could become if I let it go. To start treating it as a choice rather than a default. That felt like something. What I hadn't expected, what blindsided me in the way that only things you weren't watching for can, was the conversation with my son. Marcus was 35, Grant's son from a relationship before our marriage, whom I had helped raise from the time he was 12. He and I had not always been close. There were years when the step-parent dynamic had been awkward and unresolved, and neither of us had known quite how to bridge it. But in the last decade, we'd found a rhythm. He called on holidays. He'd come for dinners. We weren't mother and son in the way I was with Maya, but we were something real, something that had grown through the imperfect soil of a blended family into its own kind of genuine. After the ruling, I had not heard from him. I hadn't expected to immediately. I knew he'd been in contact with Grant, and I knew that position was complicated. I gave it time. In early August, he called. I heard about the ruling, he said. He sounded careful in the way of someone who has thought about a conversation for days before making it. Yes, I said. He stopped, started differently. I've been trying to figure out what to say to you for weeks. I know you and my dad are... I know how it all went. I know what he did. A pause. He told me himself, actually, more than he probably meant to. That surprised me. What did he tell you? About the money. About how long it had been going on. Marcus's voice was careful still, but underneath it was something tight. Evelyn, I want you to know that I don't think what he did was right. I'm not going to pretend I do. I was quiet for a moment, turning that over. Thank you for saying that, I said. That genuinely means something to me. Also want to ask you something, and I understand if you don't want to answer. Go ahead. Are you going to be okay? Like, actually okay? Because I've been. He stopped again. You were there for me when I was 12, and I didn't know how to talk to anybody in that house. You were patient with me when I didn't deserve it. And I feel like I've been absent while all of this was happening, and I don't know how to fix that, but I wanted to at least ask. I sat down on the back porch step with the phone. I hadn't cried in a while, so not really, not the deep kind. I'd been operating in the clear, functional space on the other side of the worst of it. But something about Marcus's voice, its careful honesty, the acknowledgement of all those years we'd spent awkwardly becoming something to each other, that got in under the composure in a way I hadn't expected. I'm going to be okay, I said when I trusted my voice. I really am. Not because everything is fine, because it isn't, not entirely, but because I know what I'm doing. I know where I'm going. Where are you going? I looked at the garden. The tomatoes had gone full red. The season was turning. Somewhere with water, I said. I've been thinking about the coast. He was quiet for a moment. Then unexpectedly, he laughed. A short, real laugh that sounded like relief. You've been talking about the coast since I was a teenager, he said. I know. It's time then. Yeah, I said. I think it is. We talked for another 20 minutes about small things. His work, a trip he'd been planning, a restaurant he thought I'd like if I ever made it to his city. The ordinary tissue of a relationship finding its way back to itself after a strain. It wasn't seamless. There were silences that still had some awkwardness in them, threads that would need more time. But it was real, and it was forward, and that was enough. After I hung up, I sat on the porch step for a while longer. The evening was coming in slow, the way it does in August, all that light holding on past when you expect it to give up. No. Grant's world, meanwhile, was reorganizing itself in ways I heard about in fragments and did not seek out. Fielding had advised against the appeal, as Diane had predicted. The property transfers proceeded on the court's timeline. Grant, I understood, had moved into an apartment in the city, not the same one he'd been using during the marriage, but a smaller one, with considerably different economics than he'd anticipated when he'd packed his bags in February, believing he was walking into an upgraded life. Cassandra, by most accounts, was still in the picture. Whether that was going to hold up under the considerably reduced financial circumstances was a question I genuinely did not spend much time on. It wasn't my story anymore. What I did hear, from Roberta, who called me in late August with a mixture of guilt and candor that I had come to genuinely appreciate, was that Grant had lost a significant professional account at work, a client relationship he'd managed for years, a contracting company that had decided to go in a different direction. The details were vague, but the timing was not. It came in the months after the hearing, when Grant's personal situation was public enough in their professional circles that it had apparently affected confidence in him. I don't know how much of it is related, Roberta said. I'm not saying it's cause and effect, I thought you should know it's not going smoothly for him, in case that matters to you. I don't want him to suffer, Roberta, I said, and I meant it. I just needed things to be accurate. She was quiet for a moment. I know, she said. I think he does too now. Whatever that's worth. It was worth something. Small and complicated, and not nearly enough to undo anything, but something. I thought about the man I had married 23 years earlier at a dinner party where he'd made me laugh twice before the appetizers. I thought about how long things had been good before they'd started to be something else. I thought about all the ways a person can love someone genuinely and still, slowly, become capable of things they would not have believed of themselves early on. I didn't want his suffering, but I needed the truth. And the truth had come, at cost to both of us, in the form of a judge's ruling and a paper trail, and 6 months of work I had done in the quiet hours when he'd thought I was simply waiting. August ended. September arrived with its particular kind of light, cooler, more horizontal, the days shortening in a way you can feel before you can measure it. I had decisions to make. The house, the coast, the next chapter that I had been moving toward since February, since the parking lot, since the moment I'd picked up the phone and stopped talking myself out of knowing what I knew. I was 61 years old. My knee ached when rain was coming. My vegetable garden had produced more tomatoes that summer than I could possibly use, and I had given bags of them to Patricia and Roberta, and the neighbor on the corner whose name I always forgot. I was not starting over. Starting over implies the erasure of what came before, and I wasn't interested in that. Not the good years, not even the hard ones, not the lessons that had come at the price of genuine pain. I was starting forward, from exactly here, with exactly what I had earned. That was enough, more than enough. I was learning everything. I sold the house in October. Not because I had to, not because the memories were unbearable, or because I couldn't walk through those rooms without falling apart. I'd already tested that, and while it wasn't painless, it wasn't unbearable either. I sold it because keeping it would have been a choice made from fear, and I had made enough fear-based choices in the last decade of my marriage to last me the rest of my life. I was done making them. The real estate agent was a woman named Carol, practical and efficient, who walked through the house with a clipboard and said very little that was sentimental. I appreciated that. She gave me a number. I accepted it with minor negotiation, and the whole thing moved with a momentum that surprised me. An offer within 11 days, a closing date set for mid-November, and a rapidly approaching deadline by which I needed to decide not just what I was leaving, but where I was going. I already knew where I was going. I'd known since I'd told Marcus on the back porch in August, in that quiet evening light. I just needed to stop treating the knowing as hypothetical and start treating it as a plan. I called Lena first. "I'm going to buy on the coast," I said. "I want to know what I can spend without touching the investment portfolio. I want that portfolio left alone to keep doing what it's doing." "Smart," she said immediately. "Let me run some numbers. Where on the coast are you thinking?" I had a place in mind, a town I'd visited once, maybe 15 years earlier, on a trip that Grant and I had taken during one of the better periods of our marriage. A small town on the Atlantic side, not tourist-heavy, the kind of place where the water was visible from the main street and the off-season felt like a genuine exhale. I had thought about it intermittently for years, filed it away as a someday place, the kind of place you promise yourself without ever quite believing the promise. Someday had arrived. Lena called back 2 days later with a clear ceiling and a set of conditions I understood immediately. Keep the portfolio intact, maintain a specific liquidity buffer, stay below a purchase price that would require dipping into the retirement accounts. The parameters were tight but workable. I wrote the numbers on a notepad and pinned it next to my laptop. Then I called a buyer's agent in the coastal town and told her I was serious. I was coming to look at properties in 3 weeks, and I needed her to understand that I was not browsing. She understood. The 3 weeks between listing and the coastal trip were the most logistically complicated of my life, which I say as a woman who had just spent 8 months navigating a contested divorce. There was the packing. Not all of it, not the full house yet, but the preliminary kind, the sorting and culling that forces you to hold every object and decide what it means to your actual life versus the life you've been storing it in. There were things I kept without question, the contents of my garden shed, my mother's pearl earrings, the kitchen table I'd owned since before the marriage. There were things I gave away with something close to relief, a set of golf clubs Grant had left behind, 14 years of accumulated holiday decorations in boxes I hadn't opened in half a decade, a guest room full of furniture that had been staged for visitors who stopped coming. And then there were the things that were genuinely hard. There was a box in the closet of the spare room, Grant's side originally, though he'd cleared out his clothes and most of his personal items when he left. What remained were things neither of us had claimed. Early photos, joint mementos, a few cards I'd saved from the first years of the marriage when things between us were still uncomplicated. I sat on the floor of that room with the box open in front of me for a long time. I want to be honest with you about what I felt, because I've been honest this whole way, and I'm not going to stop now. What I felt was grief, not for what the marriage had become, not for the man who drained the accounts and built a parallel life while I made dinner, but for what it had been, in the years before the rot had set in. For the dinner party where he'd made me laugh twice. For the early mornings when we drunk coffee together in a way that felt like enough. For the version of Grant Carter that had existed before something in him had decided that I was a resource rather than a person. That version was real. I didn't want to pretend it wasn't, because pretending would have been its own kind of dishonesty, and I was done with dishonesty in all its forms. The marriage had been real, the love had been real, and it had also eventually been betrayed in a way I would spend years fully understanding. Both of those things were true at the same time, and sitting with that, not resolving it into something cleaner, just sitting with its actual shape, was the hardest work I did in that October. I kept 2 photographs. I threw away the cards, and I closed the box and put it in the donation pile and felt something shift in my chest that I recognized after a moment as the specific relief of letting something go that you've been carrying past the point where it was helping you shut. Patricia came over the Saturday before I left for the coast. We sat on the back porch, for the last time as it turned out, though I didn't know that precisely yet, and drank coffee and looked at the garden that was going to sleep for the winter. "I'm going to miss this yard," she said. "You'll come visit wherever I land," I said. "I'm going to need someone who tells me the truth." "That's always been a one-way arrangement," she said dryly. "You never needed anyone to tell you the truth. You needed someone to make you stop pretending you didn't already know it." I looked at her. "You're right," I said. "That's exactly what it was." She nodded, satisfied in the particular way of a woman who has been right about something important and is not going to make a speech about it. We sat with the quiet for a while, the way old friends can. The garden beds were mulched over for winter, the tomatoes long finished, the beans pulled up weeks ago. Just the bare structure of what had been growing all season, resting now, holding its shape through what was coming. "Grant called me," Patricia said after a while. I looked at her sharply. "When?" "2 weeks ago. He wanted to know—" She paused, working out how to say it. "He wanted to know if I thought you were really okay, or if you were just performing okay." "What did you tell him?" "I told him that was no longer his question to ask." She looked at me over her coffee mug. And then I hung up. I felt something loosen in my chest, gratitude, mostly, but also the particular warmth of knowing that the people who love you have your back in the specific ways you need it. "Thank you," I said. "You don't have to thank me for that," she said. "That was just the obvious thing." We stayed on the porch until the light went and the air got too cold, and then we went inside and she helped me wrap the kitchen dishes for the move, and we talked about nothing important, which is to say we talked about everything that actually matters. The coastal town was exactly what I remembered, and also completely different, because I was completely different from the woman who had visited 15 years earlier. I drove down on a Tuesday, arrived by early afternoon, and checked into a small inn 3 blocks from the water. The buyer's agent, whose name was Miriam, met me at 4 o'clock and was as no-nonsense as I'd hoped. 5 properties lined up over 2 days, information packets already prepared, no time wasted on anything that didn't fit my parameters. The first 3 properties were not right, too large, or facing the wrong direction, or with a layout that felt like someone else's idea of a life rather than mine. I knew within 10 minutes of each one, and I didn't drag it out. The 4th property stopped me in the doorway. It was smaller than I'd imagined, a cottage, really, though that word undersells it. Single story, 3 bedrooms, a kitchen that faced east, a back deck that stepped directly down toward the water with an unobstructed view of the inlet. The yard was modest and a little rough, clearly hadn't been loved for a few years. But the bones were there, the orientation was perfect, and standing in the kitchen at 4:30 in the afternoon, with the October light coming in off the water, I felt something I hadn't felt in a long time. I felt like I was in the right place. "What's wrong with it?" I asked Miriam, because something was always wrong, and I'd learned to ask directly. Foundation inspection came back with a minor crack, non-structural, but it needs sealing. Previous owners had a water heater issue last winter. It's been replaced, but the insurance history shows the claim. And the yard, as you can see, "I can fix a yard," I said. "I know," she said, watching my face. "You want to see the 5th property?" "No," I said. "I want to make an offer on this one." She smiled. Not the salesperson smile, but the real one. "I was hoping you'd say that." The negotiation took 4 days and was mildly contentious in the way that real estate negotiations always are. The sellers wanted more than the inspection justified. I offered less than they wanted. We landed somewhere that felt accurate for what the property actually was. not what they hoped it would be, not what they wished it were worth, what it actually was. I had become very interested over the past year in things being what they actually were. I signed the papers in Miriam's office on a Friday morning in late October, and then I drove to the inlet and sat in my car and looked at the water for 20 minutes. Just the water. The particular gray-green of the Atlantic in late fall, the way the light moved on it, the smell of salt that came through the vents, even with the windows up. I had dreamed about this for 15 years. It did not look exactly like the dream. It was smaller and messier, and the foundation needed sealing, and there was a lot of yard work in my immediate future. But it was real, which the dream never was, and real. I had learned this the hard way, across 23 years and 8 months of the hardest season of my life. Real is always worth more than the version you imagined. I called Maya. I bought it, I said. A pause. A half-second of held breath. And then, Mom, oh my God, tell me everything. So I told her everything, sitting in my car at the inlet with the water in front of me and November coming in off the ocean like something being slowly, inevitably delivered. The move happened in stages, the way big changes always do when you're doing them honestly rather than just dramatically. The house closed in mid-November. I spent 2 weeks between Patricia's guest room and the inn at the coast, moving boxes in my own car while the larger furniture waited for the moving company I'd booked for the first Saturday of December. It was inefficient and tiring, and I was 61 years old with a bad knee, and I did not care even slightly. Maya came for the moving weekend. She drove up Friday night, and we ordered food to the inn and sat on the small bed and talked until past midnight. And when I fell asleep, I slept better than I had in months. The movers arrived Saturday morning in a truck that was slightly too large for the cottage's narrow driveway and had to be redirected to the street, which added 45 minutes and a small argument between 2 of the crew members that resolved itself by mid-morning. By afternoon, the furniture was in, the boxes were stacked in ways that made logical sense to no one but me. And the kitchen, the east-facing kitchen with the water view, was mostly functional. Maya put the kettle on while I stood in the doorway to the back deck looking at the inlet in the winter afternoon light. "How does it feel?" she asked from the kitchen. I thought about it honestly. "Like it's mine," I said. "Not ours. Not anyone else's idea. Mine." She brought me a mug and stood beside me in the doorway. "That's the right answer," she said. We stood there together for a while, looking at the water, not saying anything. The light was going. The inlet had gone silver gray in the last of the afternoon. Somewhere across the water, a boat was moving slowly in the direction of the channel, its lights just visible in the early dusk. I thought about the morning Grant left. The kitchen, the gray light, the $47. I thought about all the moments between then and now that had been hard in ways I hadn't always known how to survive. And I thought about the fact that I had survived them. Not gracefully, not without breaking down on floors and lying awake at 3 a.m. running courtroom hearings in my head, but I had survived them, and here I was, 61 years old, standing in the doorway of my own kitchen, looking at the water I had been dreaming about for 15 years. I had not lost. I had not merely endured. I had arrived. December brought the particular quiet of an off-season coastal town, which is a quiet I came to love almost immediately. The summer people were gone. The restaurants kept shorter hours. The streets in the early morning were empty in a way that felt like a gift rather than an absence. I started walking every morning, down to the inlet and back, about 2 miles round trip, whatever the weather. I had good rain gear, and the bad knee held up better than I expected. The flat terrain of the coast suited it in a way that the hills at the old house hadn't. I was out by 7 most mornings, home by 8:30, making the second cup of coffee that I drank in the east-facing kitchen, watching whatever the water was doing that day. It sounds simple because it was. That was the point. I also started on the yard. Not immediately. December was not the month for ambitious yard work, but I spent 2 weekends assessing it carefully, taking notes on what was there and what had been neglected and what the soil composition looked like once I dug into it a little. It was going to take a full season to bring it to anything I was proud of. That was fine. I had a full season. I had several of them. And I made one other decision that December, the one I hadn't quite anticipated, but which felt, Once I was in the quiet of the new house with time to think clearly for the first time in almost a year, like the most obvious thing in the world. I called a local women's financial literacy organization I'd found in the town, a small nonprofit that offered workshops and one-on-one sessions for women navigating financial decisions, particularly those going through major life transitions. I had found them through a community board at the coffee shop on Main Street, their flyers slightly askew on the corkboard next to a real estate listing and an ad for a Spanish class. I called and asked about volunteering. The woman who answered, the director as it turned out, a no-nonsense woman named Helen, who reminded me slightly of Diane, said they were always looking for people with financial management backgrounds. "What's your background?" she asked. 15 years of office management, payroll, contracts, budgeting, I said, and one very thorough divorce. A pause, and then she laughed, a real laugh, the kind that recognizes something. "When can you come in?" she said. I started the following week. One afternoon, then two, doing intake sessions with women who came in carrying the particular kind of confusion and fear that I recognized from the inside. Women who didn't know what they had because someone else had always managed it. Women who had trusted completely and were now trying to find their footing in a financial landscape that felt foreign and hostile. Women who'd been told, implicitly or explicitly, that this wasn't their domain. I sat across from them and I told them the truth. You can learn this. It is not as complicated as you've been led to believe, and knowing it is the difference between being left with nothing and being left with your life intact. I didn't tell them my story. Not in those sessions. That wasn't what they were there for. But I think some of them sensed it anyway, the way you sense when someone is speaking from experience rather than just knowledge. There's a texture to it. Helen, after my third week, stopped me on the way out. "You're good at this," she said. "I needed someone to do this for me once," I said, or something like it. I figured out most of it on my own, which took longer than it should have. "That's usually how people end up here," she said, on either side of the table. In late January, I got a letter from Marcus. Not an email, an actual letter, handwritten, which surprised me enough that I stood at the mailbox reading it before I went inside. He wrote that he'd been thinking a lot about the last year, about his father and about me, and about what it meant to watch someone you respected choose a course of action that hurt someone else he cared about. He wrote that he didn't know how to fully reconcile the father he'd known growing up with the man who'd done what Grant had done, and that he suspected he'd be working on that for a long time. Then he wrote something that I've read several times since. I think the thing that got me most was that you didn't let it make you bitter, or at least, you didn't let the bitterness be the whole story. You just kept moving. I don't know if you realize how rare that is, but I've been watching people my whole life and I'm telling you it's rare. Dad thought he knew who you were. He was wrong. I hope I know who you are a little better than he did. Anyway, I'm glad you found your coast. I stood in my east-facing kitchen and read that letter twice and then set it on the table and looked at the water for a while. I thought about bitterness, about whether I had it or didn't, about where the line was between righteous anger and the corrosive kind that eventually eats you more than the person who caused it. I didn't think I'd avoided bitterness entirely. There had been nights, particularly in those early months, when what I felt was not clean or instructive or morally legible. It was just hot and tangled and unfair feeling, the way injustice actually feels when it's happening to you, rather than being observed from a safe distance. But I hadn't let it set. That was the more accurate thing. I'd felt it, and I'd moved through it, and I hadn't let it harden into the thing that would follow me into every room I walked into for the rest of my life. Partly that was intentional. Partly it was practical. I didn't have the energy to carry it, not with everything else there was to do. And partly it was something I'd arrived at slowly, in the quiet of the new house and the morning walks and the sessions at Helen's organization. The understanding that what Grant had done was about him, his choices, his failures, his willingness to look at our shared life and see a resource rather than a relationship. That was not a reflection of my worth. That was a reflection of his limits. And I refused, I absolutely refused, to define myself by someone else's limits. Spring came to the coast in April, slowly and then all at once, the way it always does. The water changed color. The mornings went from raw to merely cool. The yard began to show what it had been holding under the mulch all winter. I was out in it every weekend by March, and by April it was beginning to look like something intentional. I'd put in a raised bed along the south fence, smaller than the old garden, but oriented better, more sun, better drainage. The first seedlings were in by mid-April. Maya came for a weekend in late April, and we spent Saturday afternoon in the yard, her following my instructions with cheerful imprecision and me correcting her with the patience I'd never quite managed when she was a teenager. "You should have been a gardener," she said, pressing a seedling into the bed with slightly too much force. "Gently," I said, "and I'm 61. There's time." "Is that what retirement looks like for you? The garden and the volunteer work?" I thought about it. "For now. Ask me again in a year." She sat back on her heels and looked at me with the directness she'd always had, even as a child. "You look different," she said, "from before, like not younger exactly, just—" She searched for it. "Like you're actually here." I understood what she meant. "I wasn't," I said. "For a long time I was managing everything around me and not actually in any of it. Too busy keeping things smooth to actually be present in them." "Is that what happens in a bad marriage?" "It's what happened in mine," I said carefully. "I'm not qualified to speak for anyone else's." She nodded, turning back to the seedlings. "I think about that sometimes. How you ended up there. Because you're not a person who lets things happen to them." "I was, though," I said. "For years. Very quietly. You can be strong and capable at work, strong and capable with everyone else, and still manage to be absent from your own life in the parts that matter most. It's not a stupidity thing. It's a slow erosion thing. You lose a little ground every time you decide the piece isn't worth disturbing, and then one day you look up and you've given over so much ground you can barely see where you started." Maya was quiet for a moment, pressing another seedling in with more care this time. "How do you get it back?" "You make one decision that's actually yours," I said, "and then another one, and you keep going." She looked up at me. "Like calling Diane," she said. "Like calling Diane," I said. "Dit, I want to talk to you directly now. You, whoever you are, wherever you are, watching this story play out from your own life and your own circumstances. Because this isn't just Evelyn Carter's story. It's not just one woman's divorce and one man's betrayal and a courtroom and a coastal cottage. It's a story about something much more fundamental than that. It's about the moment when a person who has been slowly, quietly diminished finally stops accepting the diminishment, and what it costs, and what it makes possible. I am not a perfect woman. I want to be clear about that because the version of this story that gets told too often is the one where the protagonist is entirely right and entirely wronged and entirely redeemed by the end, and real life is not that clean. I made choices during my marriage that I'm not proud of. The choice to see the bank statement and put it back without asking, again and again. The choice to prioritize peace over truth for years. The choice to manage everything around my discomfort rather than addressing the thing that was causing it. Those choices didn't cause what Grant did. I want to be very clear about that. What he chose to do with 30 months and $100,000 and another woman was his choice, made by him, and the responsibility for it lives entirely with him. But my silence created the conditions he operated in. My willingness to smooth things over, to not ask the question, to give the benefit of the doubt past the point where doubt had any reasonable benefit, that was mine. And I've had to sit with that. The thing I want you to hear, the thing I needed someone to say to me years earlier than anyone did, is this. Knowing that something is wrong is not the same as being weak for not acting on it immediately. Understanding that takes time. But once you really know, you have to act. Not for revenge, not to win, but because your dignity, your security, your actual life require you to. You have the right to protect what you built. You have the right to know what you have. You have the right to understand your own financial life, your own legal position, your own options, regardless of how long you've let someone else handle those things, regardless of how long you told yourself it was easier not to know. Knowledge is not aggression. Preparation is not betrayal. Protecting yourself is not the same as hurting someone else. And let me say this, especially to those of you who are older, who are in the later decades of your life, who may have spent years in a version of what I was in, who may have heard the voice in your head that says you're too old to start over, too far along to change the direction, too settled in one place to move toward the life you actually want. You are not. 61 is not the end of anything. It is, I say this having lived it, the beginning of the first life you get to build entirely on your own terms, with everything you've learned and survived and earned, with eyes that have seen enough to know the difference between what matters and what doesn't, with a clarity about what you want that you could not have had at 30, because at 30 you hadn't yet learned what it cost you to go without it. The coast was always out there. The water was always there. I just had to be ready to actually go. And it's May now as I tell you this. The garden is fully planted. The yard looks like something someone loves. The east-facing kitchen gets the morning light in a way that I still stop and notice almost every day because it still feels like a gift rather than a given. I walk to the inlet every morning. The bad knee is holding up. The coffee is good. Patricia visited last month and declared the cottage alarmingly charming, and spent 45 minutes interrogating Helen about the financial literacy organization before announcing she wanted to start something similar in our old town. Knowing Patricia, she'll have it running by fall. Marcus called last week just to talk. We talked for an hour about his work, about a documentary he'd been watching, about a trip he was thinking of taking. At the end of the call, he said, "I'm really glad you ended up somewhere good." I said, "Me too." And then we said goodbye the way people do when the goodbye doesn't feel like the end of anything. Roberta sent a card in March. A brief one, just to say she was thinking of me and that she hoped the new place was everything I'd wanted. I wrote back a longer letter than I expected to. She replied, "We are, carefully and imperfectly, finding a way to stay connected that doesn't require either of us to be something we're not. That's more than I had any reason to expect, and I'm grateful for it. Grant," I hear occasionally through Roberta, "is managing. His professional situation stabilized somewhat in the new year. The relationship with Cassandra, I understand, did not survive the reduced financial circumstances, which does not give me satisfaction exactly, but it does confirm something I had already understood about the nature of what that was. I don't wish him harm. I don't wish him much of anything, which is its own kind of freedom. He is no longer the story I'm living in. He is simply someone I used to know. At the morning of the day I'm finishing this, telling you the last of it, bringing you to the end of the road I've been walking you down. I went to the inlet at 7 as usual. May morning, the water pale and lit, the air still with that particular coastal quality of a day that hasn't decided yet what it wants to be. I stood at the edge of the inlet for a while, the way I do, just looking, not thinking about anything specific, just present in it, the way Maya said I looked now. Actually here, I am not the woman I was on that February morning with the cold tea and the $47 and the husband who believed he had taken everything. But I am, in the truest sense, the same woman, the one who knew something was wrong and finally stopped talking herself out of it, the one who sat across from a lawyer and laid out the facts and asked the right questions, the one who moved carefully and legally and thoroughly through the worst year of her adult life and came out on the other side of it with her dignity intact and her future secured. That woman was always there. She was present in the 15 years of managing payroll and vendor contracts and HR disputes. She was present in the vegetable garden she'd tended since 1998. She was present in every moment she'd kept her voice even when it wanted to break, in every document she'd reviewed with a highlighter and a notepad, in every decision she'd made not out of fear but out of the clear, quiet knowledge of what she needed and what she deserved. She was always there. She just needed someone to call her by her real name. I turned away from the water and walked home. The cottage was lit up in the early morning sun, the east windows full of light, the yard green and growing, the raised bed along the south fence coming in strong. A good season ahead. I went inside and made coffee and stood in my east-facing kitchen and watched the inlet and felt. Not perfectly happy, not without complexity, not without the occasional 3 a.m. hour when the weight of things makes itself known, but present, purposeful, entirely, unambiguously my own. That is the victory that no one can take. Not the ruling, not the property, not the money secured or the accounts protected, or the legal strategy that held up under Fielding's cross-examination. All of that mattered. All of it was necessary. But the real thing, the thing I am carrying with me into every morning that comes now, is simpler than any of it. I stopped waiting for someone else to tell me what was true, and that is where every life, reclaimed, must begin.